So let's talk about Japan in the early 20th century. You've got this nation at a real crossroads. On one hand, they're modernizing. They're an ally of the West. They're signing peace treaties. But then, just 2 decades later, they've become this aggressive military empire hurtling towards war. So the big question is, how on earth did that happen?
And right at the heart of this whole story is Emperor Hirohito. You can see him here reviewing his troops. Now, what's fascinating is how his public image completely transforms over time. He goes from this strutting militarist figure to a much more grandfatherly monarch later on. That ambiguity, that shift, it really captures the whole complex vibe of the era we're diving into.
So yeah, that's the core question we're tackling here. How did this happen? It's a real puzzle, right? It's got pieces of economics, rising nationalism, and a whole bunch of global crises that basically pushed one of the world's great powers to just abandon cooperation and go all in on conquest.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this massive shift, we've got to rewind a bit. Let's go back to the 1920s, because that decade, it looked completely different for Japan. I mean, this was a time of incredible international cooperation and a booming economy.
So, back then, the strategy was pretty straightforward. Japan's leaders knew that to be prosperous, they needed access to foreign markets and raw materials. But, and this is the key part, they decided the best way to get them was through trade and diplomacy, not through war. The goal was to become a global economic powerhouse by working with the West, not fighting them.
And if you want a symbol for this whole era, look no further than the Five-Power Treaty. This thing was a huge deal. It was basically a historic agreement to stop a crazy expensive naval arms race. Japan actually agreed to have a smaller navy. That's the 3 in the 553 ratio. Now, why would they do that? Well, in return, the US and Britain promised not to build any new military bases on their islands in the Pacific. It was a really smart compromise, and it basically guaranteed Japan's security right in its own backyard.
And guess what? This whole strategy totally worked. Trade with the US was booming. Inside Japan, things were getting more liberal. They even adopted universal male suffrage. They pulled their troops out of Siberia, which was a big signal that they were serious about peace. For a good while, this whole cooperative vibe created some real stability and a lot of prosperity.
And when I say booming, I mean it. Just how deep was that economic connection? Get this. At the peak of the 1920s, a whopping 40% of everything Japan exported went to one single customer, the United States. 40%. This wasn't just some friendly diplomatic relationship, it was the absolute engine of Japan's entire economy.
But then, everything changed. The world changed. A whole series of shocks from the outside started to tear down the very foundations of Japan's peaceful strategy. This created a huge sense of national crisis, and it gave a ton of power to the people who had been arguing for a different, more aggressive path all along.
And the pressure just kept building, one hit after another. First, you have the U.S. passing the Japanese Exclusion Act in 1924, which was seen as a major racial insult. Then, boom, the Great Depression hits and just destroys global trade. In 1930, the U.S. slops on the Hawley-Smoot tariff, jacking up taxes on Japanese goods and crippling their exports. And as if that wasn't enough, at the exact same time, a newly unified China starts to push back against Japan's really important economic interests in Manchuria.
So you can see how this feeling started to grow, right? And this quote from our source material just nails it. The expansionists, the militarists, they started making this argument that Japan was being boxed in on purpose. They're saying, look, the doors for peaceful trade are being slammed in our face. The doors for immigration are being slammed shut. Their conclusion? The only way out was to forget cooperation and just build their own self-sufficient empire.
And that brings us to the real turning point. You've got a weakened civilian government, a public that's getting really anxious, and a faction inside the Japanese army decides, you know what? Enough is enough. It's time to force the issue and take matters into our own hand. And what they did was, well, it was incredibly cynical, but it was also brutally effective. So here's the playbook. In 1931, these mid-level officers over in Manchuria, they stage a tiny explosion on their own railway. Then they immediately turn around and blame it on Chinese terrorists. And just like that, they had the excuse they needed to launch a full-scale invasion. They took over the entire province of Manchuria, all without getting permission from the government back in Tokyo. By 1932, they'd set up their own little puppet state there called Manchukuo.
So how did the rest of the world react? Well, they barely did. The response was just so timid. Everyone was stuck in the middle of the Great Depression, so the major powers did pretty much nothing. The US just put out this non-recognition doctrine, which basically meant we don't officially agree with what you did, but they didn't impose any sanctions.
And that sent a crystal clear message to the militarists in Japan. Hey, aggression works, and there were zero consequences. But here's a twist. Even inside the army, there was a major power struggle going on. You had two main groups. On one side, the Imperial Wave faction. These were the younger, fanatical officers who cooked up the whole Manchuria incident. For them, conquest was almost like a spiritual mission. But then you had the more powerful control faction. These were older, more pragmatic guys. They wanted an empire too, don't get me wrong, but their plan was way more methodical. They wanted to modernize the military, take over the government, and prepare Japan for an all-out, total war.
And in the end, it was the pragmatic control faction that came out on top. Once they crushed their more radical junior officers, they started to systematically take control, and they set Japan firmly on the path toward a much, much wider war.
So what was their most important move? They forged an alliance with the Zaibatsu. These are the massive industrial conglomerates in Japan, think Mitsubishi and Mitsui. Now, these same corporations had been all for peaceful expansion before, but now they saw huge profits to be made from building up the military and cashing in on all the resources in Manchuria. And just like that, a powerful military-industrial complex was born.
And the results of this alliance? They were absolutely staggering. I mean, just look at this chart. In a little over a decade, Japan's industrial production didn't just grow, it quintupled. It jumped from 6 billion yen to 30 billion yen. The entire economy was being reshaped for one single purpose: preparing for war.
And of course, they gave this whole imperial vision a nice-sounding name: the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The propaganda was, hey, this is going to be a big family of Asian nations, led by Japan, kicking out the Western colonialists. But the reality? It was all about creating a self-sufficient empire that was controlled by Japan for the benefit of Japan, period.
From there, the final steps that sealed Japan's fate came really fast. In 1937, they launched a full-scale invasion of China. Then, in 1940, while Europe was completely engulfed in war, Japan made it official and allied with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy by signing the Tripartite Pact. And that was it. The pivot was complete. Japan was now officially an Axis power.
And all of this leads us to the final, absolutely critical question. By trying to build this empire in Asia, Japan put itself on a direct collision course with the United States. And why was that so dangerous? Because the US controlled the one resource Japan needed more than anything else: oil. So at this point, with everything that had happened, was a massive war in the Pacific truly inevitable?